you right away that when we got the title for the panel, none of us actually understood quite what we were supposed to be talking about. So, so we're sort of taking its abstract poetry as a authorization to kind of talk about whatever we want. I think that's the way to put it. You'll notice today as our speakers present their work very briefly, that we've got a range of practices that's quite extraordinary in its diversity, a huge range of approaches, media, sites, travels between text and image, use of social practice, object making, performance, video, and a range of sites and contexts in which the work is seen. Brendan Fernandez, Chitra Ganesh, Miriam Ghani, Vandana Jain, and Grit Premna all show both in places where the idea of the global as a kind of contemporary concept is produced and reproduced, as well as sites where a kind of cultural locality is much more vivid. And so I asked, as we were thinking about this, I presented a ridiculously broad framing question, which is in fact the framing question of the whole conference, which is to ask them to think about how South Asianness is operative in their work, whether that means as an identity, as a site of a particular kind of politics, as a formal touchstone, as a set of visual markers, or as a subject matter, or whatever other way. But I asked them to think about that in relation to these various sites of reception, whether their work, how and why, and whether their work changes as they move between these various types of frames for their different practices. So the way that we've decided to do this is each artist is going to speak very briefly on their work, 5 minutes max, and I will be keeping time. And we're hoping to spend a lot of time in conversation because there is such resonance between the practices. It would be nice to have time for that. So I'm going to hand it straight over to Brendan Fernandez, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. Yes, I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to talk a little bit about my work. I'm Brendan Fernandez. Very similar to many people who have been presenting, I am of South Asian background, Kenyan-born, 5th generation, immigrated to Canada, from Canada, lived in Trinidad and Tobago, and then moved to the United States. So kind of this idea of hybridity, ideas of motion and movements is something that's very much part of my work, both in terms of social, political ways of thinking about movements, but also through the kind of the language of the body. I'm a former ballet dancer, and my work is an intersection between visual arts and dance. I'm going to talk about 2 pieces. This is a piece called Faux. Faux is a piece where oh my god, this is I don't know how to use this computer. Is a piece where I hired an acting coach how to, I don't know if I moved this one. Where I hired an acting coach to teach me how to speak in my cultural accents. And in this process of trying to learn how to be oneself, thank you, I was working with this coach who teaches filmmakers how to take on accents for their acting roles. So she taught me how to speak in a Kenyan, Canadian, and an Indian accent. And for me, through this process of learning how to be authentic to myself, it was this kind of, this authoritative voice giving me instructions. And am I more authentic to myself because I've taken on this way of speaking. The passage that I'm learning, or I asked her to teach me, is from a book called Faux, written by Jim Coetzee, who's a South African writer. And in the book, it's a sequel to Robinson Crusoe. A woman named Diana is on the island with Robinson Crusoe and Friday the Primitive, and she says to Crusoe, Friday is an imbecile, he cannot speak. And Crusoe says he does not speak because he doesn't have a tongue. They, this anonymous they, have cut out his tongue. So I'm learning this passage through the instruction of this voice coach, trying to be more authentic to myself. Another piece I'm going to show is, the computers. Yeah. So talking about being mentioned a former dancer, I started to think about my body and the ways of how the dance world, accepted or didn't accept my body. Ballet is a very specific training where throughout my life as a dancer, the ballet world didn't like my feet. So as a young boy, I used to bind my feet to give me arches so I could present this desired body, or hopefully get this body. Just trying to find the project. Where is it? Why isn't this working for me? Maybe that would be great. I'm losing time. Oh my god. So in this piece, I work with the device that I used to use as a child to bind my feet, and I'm giving myself this challenge, this choreography of trying to stand up. And this is the foot device that I used to use as a child, and obviously now when I use it, I'm not training as a dancer anymore, and I should say I left the dance world due to injury, but also the ballet world was very much like, would say things to me like, your body is too small, your body, there will never be a brown Romeo. So the kind of like, the structures of those narratives in the ballet world are things that I'm sort of questioning within my work. So in this piece, the choreography is simple. It's a solo where I'm basically standing still, trying to arch my foot into the position that it's supposed to be, that is deemed beautiful, that is a desire in the world of ballet, but at the same time I'm trying to free myself and stand up, but I'm the one in power. I'm holding the device, I could just let go of it, but I'm playing with that dynamic of power within the work. So in my work I'm playing with these dynamics of hegemonies. I'm questioning my own sets of trauma, in the sense like in this piece I'm in charge of it, but making sort of a connection of, to post-colonial histories of violence where those are things that are imposed on people. Ballet, and in this instance, I'm taking on the pain, and also questioning the pleasure of it as well, because there's this sort of mastery and masochism that comes with ballet, and I'm sort of playing with that in my work. So dance for me is an ephemeral material, but it's also something that I use in terms of like sculptural installation-based process within my work. So I'll stop there. I think that was 5 minutes with a bunch of rambling, but I will continue on here.
I'm Chitra Ganesh. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Jayshree and the Asian Pacific Institute and the Asia Society. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the history of my work working site-specifically on the wall, and since we are here at the Queen's Museum, I'm starting with the piece that I did here in 2002, before this building was here. But I actually came to wall drawing in a way to sort of untether myself from the frame and the art historical lineage of painting, and I started to draw. My practice really shifted to drawing around September 11th because my studio was in Harlem and I was living in Williamsburg and I could not get to my studio for a year. So I started to draw on my kitchen table, doodle with pen and ink, and this became that. So this work is in Sumi ink, and it was about 45 feet long. So one of the things that I've encountered in my work is sort of a tension around the public space and the content of my work, which has erotic content or nudity or violence, and it's received differently in different parts of the world. this installation is part of a larger group show that was in a public library in Canada. So just saying that, you know, it's not always, and it's not always what you think. Often when I give artist talk, people are wondering like, oh, how do people react in India because it's so conservative? Actually, no. So it's not like that. It really depends on the context. A lot of my work has been, can someone show me when it's 5 minutes? I don't have my phone. Okay. So a lot of my work has been inspired by street art, like graffiti that I grew up seeing in New York, as well as the scale relationships between the human body and the imagined monumental figure that I experienced when I saw something like temple sculpture. And when you see those sculptures, you'll see these like oily stains on the parts of the sculpture that people touch a lot, and that often is actually the breasts or the shoulders or something. And I think about stuff like that when I make work like this, in that the person would be somewhat eye level to the breast. This piece is about like 16 feet high. So. I'm just going to show a couple more images. I also wanted to show you this image, which was also here at the Queen's Museum. This was done in 2005 for Fatal Love, for the show that this convening and this show is commemorating and thinking about. So this is about 8 by 21 feet. And I use everyday materials as well as scale as a point of entry for people to get into the narrative of the work and sort of place themselves within it. I wanted to talk, so one thing that I think is interesting that we've talked about, I've heard a lot about, is the idea of creating the discourse you want to be part of, or finding that there's a discourse that's lacking, and figuring out how to harness available institutions, objects, etc., to talk about those. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this piece that I did at the Brooklyn Museum, and how my context and the museum's context came together here. So I was invited to do, I typically had never worked with an actual deity in my work. It's like not something that I had really been interested in. It was more about thinking about the forms, the visual forms that happened in a lot of that mythological painting and also mythic narrative. But in this exhibition, which was at the Sackler Center at the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the mandate for that space is that every artist's exhibition has to respond to Judy Chicago's dinner party. And in Judy Chicago's dinner party, Kali is somewhat, I mean, depends on how you see it, but could be problematically represented. So the way in which Saisha, I wish she was here, but was able to get a show of my work proposed and through to the Sackler Center was having to use Kali as an anchor. So that's just sort of like the institutional politics and the way that some of these things work. So that's that, and we'll talk more shortly. Thank you.
Virus alerts interrupting the presentation of artwork. Okay, so we were asked to respond to our relationship to South Asianness, and I'm the honorary South Asian on this panel. And I thank Jayshree and everyone in Saucy for making me so welcome in the South Asian American art community for all of these years and making me this honorary South Asian among you. But I thought I would, rather than speaking specifically about how my work relates to the idea or reality of South Asia, I would talk about how both my diasporic position is simultaneously intimate and estranged, both insider and outsider, and what I glean from Afghanistan inform my work more generally. So my practice is based on research into places, spaces, and moments where social, political, and cultural structures take on visible and tangible forms, like this children's playground constructed from parts discarded by North Sea oil rigs in Norway, or this migrant labor camp in the undeveloped desert outside Sharjah, which is for rent. I'm interested in understanding both how we reconstruct the past and the present, and how we construct the present for the future through shifting public and private narratives. Sometimes this research leads me to construct a fiction or reconstruct a speculative history around documents or fragments, physical traces, or sense of place, as in much of my work with choreographer Erin Ellen Kelly and composer Qasim Naqvi on the series Performed Places. And this is the piece that we recently made in St. Louis based on China Miéville's sci-fi noir novel, The City and the City. Sometimes this leads me to witness, document, intervene in, or engineer a present-day event or temporary space. An example of that would be this project I did in 2003 to 2004 about the Constitutional Assembly in Afghanistan. Some of my recurring preoccupations include border zones, no man's lands, translations, transitions, and the slippages where culture intersect. These are flower pot barricades that follow the line of gentrification in St. Louis, which also exists in a number of other American cities now. I'm also obsessed with security cultures, archives, architectures of democracy, and national imaginaries, places where nature and artifice imitate and influence each other, and the intersections of war, trauma, memory, identity, migration, language, and loss. I also work across multiple disciplines, but all my projects share a similar research-based approach and operate through a mix of documentary, narrative, and database forms. So the project I did here at the Queen's Museum of Art, on this very wall, the Garden of Forked Tongues, is a good example of a database form project where I accumulated a collection of materials around a central inquiry, in this case into endangered languages that are spoken in Queens. And then I developed several different interfaces to that collection, including the mural on the wall, where each polygon represented one language that was slowly or rapidly disappearing from the world, but still spoken in Queens, and also had the word for tongue in that language written inside it. I also wrote an essay, and in collaboration with my very brilliant grad student, Effie Eibach, created an online version of the project as well, where there's a kind of interactive version of the same diagram that we made for the wall with data visualization. Afghanistan, a lexicon, the notebook and print portfolio is another good example of this method. It functions as part of the Documented 13 notebook series, a standalone book, a companion piece to the installation of Brief History of Collapses, a series of prints that play with the look and forms of colonial era encyclopedias. And in general, it uses the inherently variable and open structure of a lexicon to attempt a different kind of history writing. Not linear, causative, or progressive, but circular and cross-referenced, tracing both individual narratives and the larger systems and structures that enclose them, through an emphasis on spatial politics and poetics. It also makes room for rumor, speculation, and myth, and passages of pure poetry, as well as facts. So for example, this entry on loss, which says, over the past century, many things have been lost in Afghanistan. Battles, wars, soldiers, standards, ground, money, advantages, generations, blood, hearing, sight, limbs, lives, livelihoods, land, dreams, dreamers, ideas, innocence, friends, friendships, parents, children, childhood, schools, teachers, homes, villages, fields, forests, rivers, roads, bridges, dams, electricity, cities, monuments, paintings, poems, places, earrings, coins, keys, suitcases, maps, plans, plots, ways, means, sanity, reason, levity, proportion, judgment, balance, love, and hope. Sometimes what was lost can be recovered, but more often, lost stays lost. I know Chitra is going to talk more about our ongoing collaboration, Index of the Disappeared, in another panel tomorrow, so I won't go into that now. But I'll just say that, like my work with language and loss, my interest in erasures in the records and the real disappearances they enable and conceal, as well as zones of exception and spaces of persistent surveillance. are tied in many ways not only to the present-day politics and policies of the United States, but also to the present and past politics of Afghanistan, some of which I've been retracing through my project What We Left Unfinished, which is, among other things, a feature film, exhibitions, live cinema events, a book, a long-term collaboration with the Afghan Films Archive. Over this patient process of gathering together the remnants of unfinished films and the people who made them and then were scattered by war, I've learned a lot about archives, about Afghan history in and beyond the communist period, about Soviet influence in film across the region, about the left and non-alignment, about the vagaries of exile, and even about my own family, chapters of which are history I just didn't even know. So I pulled on a loose thread in the history of Afghan films, the possible existence of these 5 unfinished fiction features, and it led me down a winding path through so many stories and half-stories and obfuscations and evasions that I'm still unraveling it, 5 years later, having pursued it across 4 continents in the meanwhile. And that's how I work, with public histories, private narratives, and the gaps between them. And Afghanistan is a large part of why I work that way. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Vandana Jain. So I was born here in Jamaica, Queens, but both of my parents come from Shajapur, which is in the Malabar region of Madhya Pradesh in India. And thank you. The work that I do deals with consumerism, capitalism, and it's often overlaid with spirituality as a context. This work that we're seeing here is part of the series that I'm showing at the Asia Society, and these are casts made out of sugar taken from blister packs that are used to package products for sale. So if you look at this, this is an overhead shot of a work that is displayed on the floor, and you can see packaging that would have held headphones, pears, light bulbs, action figures, hot glue guns, hard-boiled egg packs. So part of my interest was really, I saw one of these plastic packs at Christmas, and it held a Nintendo controller. And I looked at this and realized that someone had spent all this time designing this, creating this positive, only so that they could have a negative that would then house this product so it could go on a shelf and be sold and not get stolen along the way. And for the longest time I was thinking what the best way to kind of create that positive would be. And I decided that sugar, given that its nature, it's everywhere, it's so cheap, it's our little luxury. It was kind of the perfect fit for the way, for me to realize this work. The work at the Asia Society is composed from 40 casts of the same mold. It houses a light bulb, and they're in a circle. This is another work of mine. This is coming from the tradition of Rangoli. So here I take another material that's very accessible. This is broken auto glass, which in New York is very easily available if you walk around. Maybe less so than it used to be, but as a child I found it really lovely. It was the kind of thing that your parents were just trying to get you off the street, not playing with the broken glass. This is an installation I did at the end of last year in Jamaica. This is again a floor piece. It's about 14 feet by 8 feet, and it's an overhead shot. So what was really fascinating about the site was that it took place at the Coliseum Mall. I work often with sites, and it's so interesting when this mall was so fascinating. I mean, not only had I grown up in Jamaica, Queens, but I walk into this mall, and in the basement there's like 40 different booths, all with different jewelers. And it reminded me of all the bazaars I've ever been to in India, where it's just like one place where you go to, and it's like you go to the guy you always go to. There's like 30 other people who do the same thing. So it was kind of fascinating to bring artwork within that context and sort of have a place of like complete public assembly and like shoppers just come by and experience the work. Also, with this series, I almost always use the diamonds because I'm really interested in the sort of like the taking of the glass and making it into something where the desire for that object is so created and constructed. This work is an older work. It's called Prayer Flags for Healthcare. And I made it around 2008 when we had a national debate about healthcare and it was going through Congress. It was right before the ACA got passed. But here we're, and unfortunately again, this is becoming an issue, but this work features a lot of slogans, the advocacy for healthcare, who would Jesus insure, is pregnancy a pre-existing condition, or some of the things that are written here. And this work was shown several times, but this image is taken from when it was installed in the backyard of a house that was foreclosed upon because the owner died and a lot of the debt in the house was all medical debt. This is one of my more recent works. So I often explore the floor. I like to explore non-traditional spaces with my work. I do a lot of ephemeral work, a lot of installation, directly on the floor or on the wall. It's sort of been interesting to move into the museum context because it somehow doesn't always fit so neatly. This work is more recent. I've been working directly on the wall with tape. So we're seeing holographic tape and regular tape. The image is two logos for the same Swedish group. This was Alt Åt Alla, and they're a group that's active in 12 chapters across Sweden, and their activities range from giving tours of the rich and luxurious areas to raising money for Warszawa to buy like a generator. And showing it in Falun in a smaller town where a chapter wasn't established in Sweden was really great because then I could have a lot of conversations with Swedes and we can kind of talk about like how they felt about what was happening with the refugee crisis and also just the inequalities that they see around them. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Shrestha Premnath, I go by Rit. When Aruna proposed a kind of topic which was thinking about how our work relates to South Asia, I was like, oh God, why? But it also forced me kind of to think about how I have been trying to resist that taxonomy in a way over time, and I thought I would think about it very quickly through the example of Shifter, which is a publication that I founded in 2004 and continue to edit. And Shifter, in fact, in some ways plots my journey of navigating a space outside of the spaces of art showing, I'm an artist, that were available to me. I found myself back in India in 2004 for a year. I didn't have a visa to return to the US, and I suddenly had a group of friends, artist friends in India, a bunch of artist friends in the US, and I wanted to create a kind of publication or platform where we could share ideas that were thematic, that were not related to identity in any way. And in fact, Shifter, which is a linguistic term that relates to words that are that relate directly to the one who speaks them. So the word I, for instance, is a shifter. And when each of us says I, the word changes and means something different. And so Shifter began with this intention, and as such, over the years, Naeem yesterday presented a very interesting kind of rhizome of South Asian connections, and I thought, oh, it could be kind of interesting. For a second, I thought I would try to go and highlight South Asian artists who have participated in Shifter, and then I thought, I don't really care, or that's not what Shifter is about, but there's a bunch of them. And there are a bunch of people in this room and in the show who, in fact, I met through Shifter. And over the last 2 issues of Shifter, the Dictionary of the Possible and the new issue that I've just begun, I have found myself moving into a slightly different realm, which is that I'm interested more and more in extending the time of being together and of opening up conversations within a group or amongst people, and allowing the publication to, in some way, unfold from that interaction. So in some ways, I want the publication to become smaller and smaller as the time of engagement and the depth of engagement deepens. The Dictionary of the Possible was a 1.5-year-long project of bi-weekly discussion groups where 2 people each meeting would present and lead a discussion on a keyword. And everyone who came to the discussions were added to a Google document where they could add questions, thoughts, conjectures that related to that discussion. And the edited document, the edited Google document, along with a couple of individual contributions, turned into this publication. Something that happened kind of along with the election was a feeling in some ways that I was still pulling in or inviting people that I already knew, people who were comfortable being in situations like the ones that I curated, people who were comfortable speaking in a certain way. And I wondered if it would be possible to extend this project in a way that invited people that I don't normally invite to lead a discussion, and what kinds of difficult or uncomfortable situations that might produce. And with this idea, and inspired by Gayatri Spivak's use of the word unlearning in one of her interviews, I began this series called Engagements in Learning Through Unlearning. I won't go, how many minutes do I have? Okay, so I'll very quickly read through the tenets of engagements in learning through unlearning. But very quickly, the first person who I invited was a person who I was really interested in, who I talk to every day, but have never quite figured out how to engage in a kind of formal sense. And he's the guard who sits at the New School building where I teach, Musakhar Bhatt. And I invited Musakhar to lead a listening session on the Call to Gather, which is what he listens to every morning. And I expect this series to unfold over the next year or 2, and these are the kind of broad points of departure. Each session is about a labor of love. Professional amateurism should be embraced. Our time is ours, and we learn anew how to use it. Economic value is not a sufficient logic for how we spend our time. Rather than describe, we will enact. More than speaking, we will look and listen. Suggestions take precedence over directions. The process matters more than the outcome. The process matters most when we are engaged. We have no time for cynicism and postures of solemnity. Sincerity, humility, and openness are our basic values. So hopefully you'll hear more about it, or it might fail, one of the 2.
Is it made out of beads?
I think it's all textiles. I think it's all textiles.
This one's working. So the reason that I was being such a schoolmaster about the timing is so that we could actually have a conversation up here. So thank you, everyone. So congratulations to all of the panelists for keeping within their time. That was a big achievement. But I guess, one of the things that, you knew before going in, and then it's really so apparent coming up, is in some senses how different all of your work is and how different it all relates to, it relates to some of these questions, including for Miriam, you know, in a sense, and Britt, saying like, in some senses, it doesn't relate to the question of South Asianness, or not in the way that you wanted to present it today. But actually, I wanted to go and maybe just start off with another sort of very broad question, but one that I think kept coming up for me as I was listening to you all talk, which is how you conceive of the idea of engagement. So let's step back from South Asia and think of how you're conceiving, because I think that that really is whether it's engagement with the public or engagement with history or a set of or a site, I guess. Those are the three things that I'm thinking of. I think all of you do it in very different ways, but it all seems to be very profound in your work. So, do you want to start? No, I'll let you go last since you have to start. Actually, Britt, you go first.
I guess with Shifter more recently, and also with the recent artwork, I usually don't engage so much in a public way. But I think maybe again it was after this elections that something shifted. But because I would find myself going in a taxi to the airport or something, and I would start talking to the taxi driver, who invariably was Indian or Bangladeshi, and we would start talking politics. And there was an immediate kind of intimacy that formed out of this perceived relation. We're both the same, or we somehow assume the other person has similar views. And I've become really interested in that space of intimacy, or following it, because it, in a way, precedes a kind of ethics. So I don't have to worry about who to invite and how to invite them, but I just sort of follow a kind of desire. And it seems to then open into something interesting, even if it's uncomfortable, because we might not both really share the same views once we open up this space of intimacy.
Well, when you said engagement, my mind immediately went to a different way of thinking about engagement, which is like the sense of engagé, right? This idea of like, are you engaged in the sense of committed? Like, and what are you committed to as an artist? And that's a question I've been thinking about a lot lately. This question of what do you commit to as an artist? In a political sense, in an ethical sense, in a collective sense, and who are you beyond the autonomy of your own practice? That's like one of the biggest questions I've been asking myself in the recent months, right? And I think for me it's not a question with a singular answer, it's a question that you have to kind of continually ask yourself over and over again throughout your practice that resounds through it in different ways. But I do think of myself as an engaged artist in that way, and then that leads me to engage with different publics and different audiences and different participants in my projects in particular ways that are very much animated by my sense of ethics.
I think that for me, one of the things that I was thinking about was both the bodily engagement, because so much of my work is object-based and is thinking about the human body in relationship to the made object. So that engagement happens often through the materiality of the work itself. So the kinds of points of entry that one might provide a viewer or oneself, which include objects, but they can also, for me, include which is something I've heard here too, sort of the point where two stories don't quite match up, and this liminal space in between two narratives, and having enough of an openness between the narratives so that they don't intersect neatly, but maybe that the viewer can position herself in a third space, and create a kind of third position or a completely different narrative engagement that's not about just getting the point of, you know, what the story was. So I'll stop there.
I think for me, I try and use materials that kind of seduce the viewer, but and also kind of they mimic these forms that people might be really familiar with. But then there's always something a little bit on the other side of it that maybe doesn't make sense. And it's kind of that push-pull of being able to bring someone in, making them curious through the aesthetics of the work, through the accessibility, the sheer accessibility of some of my materials, where it seems like it's already known, but then there's something that just doesn't connect, you know? Or maybe then they realize that this thing that they thought was this beautiful, South Asian, spiritual mandala is made up out of fucking logos. And then they're disturbed. They are so disturbed. And it's just amazing.
I guess for me, it's about enactment and using the body, because as a dancer, my material is my body, and then engaging with other performers who may be dancers or who may not be, it's this process of actually living through the experience, and that's our engagement. In some of my work, I'm trying to think about, when Rich said about, kind of ideas of nurture and caring. For me, in my choreography, it's about creating that sort of care for each other. The dance world can be very difficult and hard, and as I said, I left dance because I tore my hamstring. Or did I tell you that? I didn't tell you that. When I was 21, and so that ended the career. So I'm putting in my work this sort of idea of nurture and caring within the performative actions. So one of my new pieces is called Clean Labor, where I'm making visible the labor of hotel cleaners. So you're asked to participate by coming into that space and watching that labor and giving it value by actually making it visible. And in this piece, there's this kind of duet between the performer and the cleaning worker that have this sort of nurturing care. So I engage through that way, and then my audience, is just as much, participating as well in the piece.
So I'm just going to ask one more question, and then we can, I'm sure other people will have questions, but I'm cracking up at your thing about like the audience having their fucking minds blown because they realize that they're at the beautiful mandalas, but and connecting it to what you were talking about, Chitra, with the leaving the space between the stories as a point of entry. And it seems to me that one of the things that I see going on in a lot of your work is the way in which you, that space is a way of overcoming, I think, a lot of questions of the specificity of identity, and the specificity even of a kind of cultural markers. Like one of the things that it was striking me when I was looking at both your piece in the show, Miriam, and some of the stuff you were looking at, is that the images of the ride in Kabul and the images of St. Louis don't look that much different, right? Like that there's a kind of way in which the visual is able to flatten the difference between sites as much as engage specifically with those sites. And I think too, like your use of comic, the visual markers of comics, or your use of these sort of common, incredibly common commercial sort of forms as well. That there's a way in which that opening is made in very visual terms, right? And that it's both, or in a sense, that refusal of excessive difference allows for a kind of, I don't know, people were talking yesterday about a universal audience, which I actually don't believe exists, but I do believe like an audience that's not allowed to simply understand something in the form of otherness is possible. And I'm wondering if that's something that you think about or something that you're sort of working through at all in your work, especially, Brendan and Rit, since I didn't sort of have that necessarily thought out before.
I think, you know, just when you're just speaking, it made me think about, like, you know, the corps de ballet in a dance company, a ballet company, classical ballet company, where, you know, we move together, we dance together. We may not actually be, like, physically, like, you know, touching each other, but there's a way that you can move bodies together without, you know, actually, you know, like seeing each other or touching each other. And I feel, for me, that's something that's really important and powerful, this idea of, like, dancing together. And I think dance in itself comes as something that is, you know, can be confrontational, but it's also an invitation to celebrate. You know, it doesn't have to be formalized. And for me, that's a way of sort of thinking about, you know, it as an invitation for engagement, for participation, for celebration as well.
That's what we're asking the question. We were just reminding each other what the question
No, I mean, I think I think the cultural specificity or lack thereof is interesting to me because maybe going kind of back to the way in which the resistance to cultural specificity comes out of the fact that I grew up in Bangalore watching, like, art films and Hollywood films in a very kind of global, cosmopolitan way. So when I came to the US, I didn't really have culture shock. Like, I felt like I kind of knew the culture. And so in that sense, I feel like we carry multiple places with us. And so but there's always space for kind of misunderstanding, but also a space for projection and possibility and indeterminacy in that kind of assumption that we share something in common. And I'm really interested in that, and I think when I started Shifter, for sure, in fact, like the first couple of issues, I was the sole editor, after which I had two fictitious co-editors, Gunnar Heiler, Von Lugan, and Peter D. Hyde, because I thought they would be more authoritative in rejecting friends' submissions. So I thought, like, two white European dudes would be great. But they didn't do any work, so I ended up collaborating with real people. but it was a way to open up a space that was not culturally specific, in part because I didn't feel like my experience was culturally specific.
I do want to push back a little bit against this idea of visuals potentially flattening the differences between places. I think, you know, what I've been interested in a lot of my work is through research finding unexpected points of connection between places. People wouldn't necessarily think were connected in their histories, but definitely not trying to visually equate them or suggest that they are, like, actually equivalent or similar. And I think there's a funny story about St. Louis and Kabul that I can tell you, which is that when I was first presenting the city in St. Louis, I gave a talk at the opening, and I showed that very, not that image, but another image of barricades in St. Louis where there were just these concrete rings. They weren't pretty flower pots, they were just concrete rings. And I said, you know, we have these exact same barricades in Kabul, and the whole room just went, you know? Like it had never occurred to them that what they were doing was something like what happens when people create green zones in war-torn territories. That was fascinating, and that was a really, really interesting kind of rupturing moment. But I think and the particular image that we showed from the piece is an image of a neighborhood that was destroyed by St. Louis, like a formerly, a historically African-American neighborhood, Mill Creek Valley, that was destroyed by St. Louis University during their expansion. So it is a place of violence, you know, violence of urban renewal enacted on a particular population. So, you know, there's ways in which these histories connect, but if you saw the entire film, the two works would not look like similar. I just wanted to say that. And I think in terms of like specific using spaces of between narratives to kind of escape from specific identity markers being attached to the work, I think for many of us who actually exist in those spaces in between already and anyway and always, because we are not definitively one thing or the other, it is actually extremely irritating to have someone try to pin a specific identity marker onto you, which is not actually your entire identity. It only describes like 1/4 of your identity. And so of course we try to live in the space in between, like, because that is actually our space, right? That's actually where we've always been, right?
For me, I think it was cultural markers, whatever the idea was that came to my head first, I was thinking that when I think of identity and my own position, the two kind of cultures that I feel like I inhabit or think about are queer culture and New York culture. Like those are actually the spaces of, so it's, yes, my body is racially marked and that's how I proceed through the world, but there's the capacious and irreducible quality of those categories are something that has appealed to me. And so I would say that my material is as much drawn from like an urban detritus that I became friends with by passing on the way to school every day, as it might be from the fragments of the immigrated culture that would be happening in a domestic space. So I think that there's also these other ways of vocation and other like more slippery, less absolute kinds of ways of thinking about things. And I think for myself growing up in this way, I really appreciated blackness and how blackness functions as this kind of capacious category where you didn't, at least in my own experience, I didn't see this kind of half this and half that and a quarter this and a quarter that and I'm half white, which I did see a lot in the Desi community, but because of the sort of historic, the lineage of that term, that was also something that informed how I understood my own intersectional identity.
And I think following up on with Chitra and what she's talking about, the sort of the communities we've all found ourselves in, I think for me, I spent a lot of time working with ABC Nerio, which is like an anarchist DIY punk rock space, and you know, it's completely different in that the identity is driven by your thoughts on economics and politics, and that like is profoundly what my work is about, and it is an identity, but it's not my South Asian identity, and it's always something I'm trying to resolve, and there's a very long conversation I can have with you if you really want about that, but I try and, you know, I think that we all bring this history with us, we have these multiple histories within us, and they're all particular to us, and I think the challenge is, how do we bring it all together? You know, these communities are really wonderful, and we can share so much with one another. But how do we keep ourselves outside of that box as well? How can we keep those boxes open?
So I don't kill the messenger. Purana has asked, because the day is going a little late, so that there's time for the next panel, that we wrap it up. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you to the speakers for
So we're just about to start our